I want to do a bit more of a deep dive into a field of awakening, or you could say a teaching on awakening that's often spoken about, but I think also often given short change, maybe misunderstood, not delved into deeply, and it can easily be misconstrued. And this is dependent origination. Now, you might have heard dependent origination before. It's got a lot of names. It might be dependent arising, conditioned co-production, dependent co-arising. It's quite a difficult thing to translate. It's originally a teaching from the Buddha. The Buddha spoke about dependent arising as, well, basically one of his core insights into the nature of the mind and the nature of phenomena. You could say the nature of existence, but we could explore that a little, and how we suffer specifically. So I thought I'd take some time to explore what it points to dependent origination, and how, by having kind of an understanding of it and also exploring it in practice, we can look to free ourselves from conditioned suffering. So this video is probably going to be quite a lot longer than usual because it's a big area. So I might do some chopping and editing, and it might, I've never done anything quite like this before, so it might be terrible or it might not work, but we'll give it a go. Dependent arising. So I've often heard it spoken about in the context of subject and object co-arise dependent on each other. So you have like the self and other, the nature of emptiness and form, the things in the world arising dependent upon the perception of the things. That's kind of how it's been reduced. It's like a shorthand that's used often nowadays, and that's fine. However, it kind of it's a redacted, reduced, direct pointer that came out of Mahayana Buddhism, specifically from a scholar called Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna was a deeply realized, and also you could say one of the most successful or the most insightful Buddhist scholars, studying at Nalanda University. So basically Nagarjuna had already deeply realized the truth of being, whatever that is, and recognized that actually through his own kind of logical expression, he's able to paraphrase dependent origination or dependent arising as there's this that arises independent of that. That's great. And it sounds really easy when you put it that way. It's like obvious, but actually that's quite a difficult thing to experience. The simultaneous arising of this and that, how this is that and that is this, is kind of what he's pointing to. That's really difficult to experience and to understand, to see it. So actually it's really worthwhile to go back to the original teachings on dependent origination. Now, this was, it's deeply profound. You could say that this teaching, this realization by the Buddha Gautama upon his awakening, upon his enlightenment, was what kind of set him out from other contemporaries at the time. He was able to, or he talks about in a lot of the suttas about his teachings, he talks about how at that point of enlightenment, he was able to delve deeply into the nature of phenomena and see how things arise dependent on other things, or you could say how conditions arise codependently, interdependently. and how that binds us to suffering. So it's like an incredibly deep insight. And then from that, he spoke about specific steps or specific links of conditionality that play out, you could say, in the mind, really. That's what he's pointing to. But they play out in existence, in the experience, and they keep us bound to a life of becoming and a life of suffering, really, of becoming a self who suffers. So yeah, I mean, like deep, profound stuff. And he kind of paraphrased it in like a really pithy phrase. Now, this phrase I talked about Nalanda University. I think this was like, well, it was the biggest religious university maybe that's ever existed in India. I think it was in the 7th century before it got torn down. But like all over Nalanda University, kind of carved into stones, into the stonework, was the core aspects of this teaching. And it was this phrase, it's this being, that becomes. On the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that does not become. On the ceasing of this, that ceases. So when I say that, and when I heard that, and it's a visceral reminder into the nature of arising and ceasing conditions. And it sounds pretty simple. So simple, in fact, that one of the Buddha's disciples, Ananda, who was an awake being in his own right, like he was a deep teacher, a deep practitioner. He guided a lot of people on the path. He famously, I say famous in Buddhist circles, he famously said, "It's amazing, Lord, it's astounding how deep this codependent arising is and how deep its appearance, and yet, to me, it seems as clear as can be." So he's basically saying, yeah, I get it, I get it. These apparent things and phenomena and conditions arise independent of each other, including myself. I arise dependent on the things, and the things arise dependent on me. So he's saying, yeah, it's clear as can be. And the Buddha's response was, don't say that, Ananda. Do not say that. Deep is this dependent co-arising, and deep its appearance is because of not understanding and not penetrating this Dharma, that this generation is tangled, or is like a tangled skein, a knotted ball of string, like matted rushes and reeds, and does not go beyond the plains of deprivation, woe, and bad destinations, suffering, basically. So yeah, I mean, the Buddha's saying to one of his core disciples, like, yeah, I get that it appears clear to you that this being that becomes. However, this is deep in its appearance, deep in its co-arising, and it's by not understanding this and seeing it clearly that we are, as people, are bound to a life of suffering. And it talks about all of life, all of human life being bound to suffering. So he doesn't just stop there, and that's the beauty of this. So what I wanted to do is explore that which is not really spoken about, and it's the 12 links on the chain of becoming. So they're often called the 12 Nidanas. So Nidana is a Pali word that means link. It means like link on a chain, basically. So the Buddha kind of breaks down sequentially how this codependent arising or dependent origination appears or is experienced in the human mind, and how by us being heedless and not seeing this dependent co-arising, we are bound to suffer. And he says there's 12 sequential links on the chain, kind of one after the other after the other. One thing conditions the next thing, conditions the next thing. That's kind of what he's pointing to. But the tricky and difficult part of this, so I'm going to talk about the 12 links on the chain, but the difficult part of this as well is that when you start exploring it, you start realizing, it's not like, I can catch that one thing conditioning the next thing. It kind of it's sequential and simultaneous in a way. One of my teachers once said that trying to identify the individual links of dependent arising, it's like falling out of a tree and trying to count every branch. It's just like this tumble of conditions that unfolds. But luckily, there's some teachings and some practice we can use to try and identify how these conditions play out in our lives and how they bind us to suffering. So, the 12 links of dependent origination, which are sequential. So, essentially, he talks from the ultimate consequence, basically, of pain, death, sickness, lamentation, suffering, really. So I'll read them out as the Buddha has read them from the beginning to the end, and then we can explore them. And I'll probably try and do some video editing where I can put them sequentially, easy to see, maybe here or maybe here, we shall see. So in the Paticca-samuppada-vibhanga Sutta, I know it's a bit of a long name, isn't it? But basically this is where the Buddha talks about Paticca-samuppada. So Paticca-samuppada is the Pali term to reference dependent origination. So the Buddha says, what is dependent co-arising? And he gives you the 12 links of the chain. So he says, from ignorance as a condition comes fabrications or volitions. From volitions as a requisite condition comes consciousness. From consciousness as a condition comes name and form. From name and form as a condition come the 6 senses. From the 6 senses as a requisite condition come contact. From contact as a requisite condition comes feeling. From feeling as a condition comes craving. From craving as a condition comes clinging and attachment. And from attachment as a condition comes becoming. From becoming as a condition comes birth. And from birth as a condition comes aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair. Such is the origination of this entire mass of stress and suffering. So I know there's a lot to think about there. You don't need to remember any of it, which is great, because like I said, we'll put it up. And it's not a case of remembering these individual things. It's recognizing that, oh, actually, this process of becoming a self that suffers through death, pain, distress, despair, lamentation, this conditioned process is nuanced. It's complex. And it plays out second by second. The Buddha's kind of pointing to how we are born into each moment from ignorance. So let's say there is a stimulus in my life. Something happens. Somebody says something to me. Well, if I am ignorant on a fundamental level, and I'm not talking about I've got like an ignorant character trait. I mean that I don't have the requisite insight into the nature of existence, then this chain of becoming just goes, it just fires off it goes down the track. And it will always result in a me becoming through attachment, clinging, craving, and then always will result in suffering. So really the Buddha's kind of pointing to, that you've got these 12 steps, you could say, on the path, or steps on the process of becoming, and the process of becoming the one that suffers. But really it's all born of ignorance. It's all born of ignorance. Now it's worth pointing out as well that when they talk about ignorance, what he's really talking about is lack of seeing, lack of gnosis or knowledge. I'm not talking about knowledge of the mind, knowledge of individual things, academic knowledge, as in knowledge of the nature of existence, knowledge of the nature of experience. So ignorance is in Pali avijja, as opposed to vijja, which is gnosis, knowledge. Avijja is the lack of knowledge, lack of seeing. So from the lack of clarity comes this entire like steamroller of becoming, which chains us to suffering. So that's quite a lot. That's quite a lot. So if you're with me so far, well done. I keep looking down, sorry. I'm looking at, the notes, basically. I'm looking at some suttas, which is where it's all laid out. I mean, I've worked with this a lot, but yeah, I mean, I don't remember all the suttas off my head. I'm not a total nerd. I'm just a bit of a nerd, it seems. So, yeah, if you're with me so far, well done. So really what I'm pointing to, in summary so far, is that dependent arising is subtle, it's nuanced. It appears that it can be simply felt into in the first instance, but it's much deeper, much more complex than it first appears. And it's very useful to explore and understand how we become in the world, how our experiences in the world just propel us on this chain of becoming. Because if we don't see that, like I said, if there's ignorance and there's a lack of seeing of this process, we are bound to suffer, bound by chains, quite literally, conditional chains of becoming. We're bound to be the one who suffers from pain, lamentation, sorrow, death, sickness, you know, all of those things, suffering, deep suffering. So the teaching really points to, well, being able to see how we are conditioned, to see this dependent arising of conditions that leads to suffering, and then to explore that facet of existence of us which is unconditioned. So you might have heard the term the unconditioned in the past when people talk about awakening, enlightenment, you know, Buddhism, Dharma, whatever. This is where it's kind of where it's from, it's what it's pointing to. So the Buddha is pointing to freedom from conditioned suffering. So it's not finding a place called the unconditioned, where there's no us that finds it. It's being free from the conditioned self that becomes and suffers. And when we find that freedom, there is the unconditioned, unborn, unbound, unmanifest nirvana, as the Buddha would say. Now you might be thinking, well, this is a lot. This is a lot to deal with. And well, yeah, it is. And that's the point, is that this is complex. The nature of conditioning is complex. You can't just say a simple term like I arise dependent upon things, or things arise dependent upon me. We arise codependently, or we co-arise together, and then expect to have a deep insight into the nature of suffering, because actually what the Buddha's pointing to here is that there's lots of different facets to this chain of becoming. How we become the one that suffers is dependent upon lots of different, you could say, elements of conditioning. And the beauty of this, let's say it's here, the beauty of this is that it's laying out those different chains, the different links in the chain of suffering, the chain of conditioned suffering. So we can then explore it. We can explore how my craving conditions my attachments. So when you break it down like that, it starts to become quite easy. You can start feeling into the moment where craving arises, as an example, and then feeling, well, actually, how have those cravings born attachments in my life? What am I attached to? So an easy one to feel into could be, I crave cigarettes and I am attached to smoking I've been a smoker. I've been deeply attached to smoking. Like, talk about attachments, and that's one of the ones that was probably the deepest for me. Even like way after awakening, it took me a long time to kind of feel into and see the depth of this attachment, the depth of this conditioning. And what I've said there kind of points to the fact that actually, even once you've had awakening experiences, whilst there's still fundamental ignorance, fundamental lack of clear seeing, we are bound to this chain. We are bound to become the one who suffers. So this is can be a lifetime's work until we're fully free from all of the conditioning, or you could say until we clearly see the nature of conditioned existence, then we are bound to become, and we become the one who suffers. So yeah, from, like I said before, craving conditions attachment. And that's an easy one to feel into, isn't it? You can think, yeah, okay, yeah, I see how that happens. And then you can start exploring that in your own experience, maybe in meditation or just in life. Like, what am I, like, is there a sense of craving right now? Like a strong desire to get something. That's often how craving appears. Or you could have the strong desire to get rid of something. It's a different type of craving. But still, the craving to change something, for conditions to change. And can I feel how when I follow that craving without clear seeing, without mindfulness, without investigation, I become attached. I become attached to feeling a certain way, thinking a certain way, being a certain type of person. So yeah, let's use the example of social media followers when we're talking about craving and attachment. There's been a feeling, and you can see we're going like one down, there's been a feeling, a momentary feeling of satisfaction from seeing my subscriber count, my follower count, my like count go up. So that feeling drives craving. It's like, oh, that was a pleasant feeling. So actually, I want more. I want to have more, because if I get more, I can maybe perpetually feel good. I can have that pleasant feeling forever. Now, that is rooted in ignorance. You can sense that. Of course it is. There's no way I can feel amazing forever. But because there's a lack of seeing, it feels that way. So then I start craving more followers. So maybe I make more videos, or maybe I pay somebody to buy me followers. And I think that's a thing that you can do. And I become attached to feeling that way. I become attached to being the one who has an audience, let's say. Now, what this path is showing us is that is destined to result in suffering. Always, 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 always. Whilst we are bound to this path of becoming, this, or chained to this process of becoming, it will always cause suffering. But it's so difficult to see, isn't it? Because in the moment, it kind of feels good. And it also doesn't mean, well, don't be in the world. Of course we can be in the world, but be in the world without delusion. So yeah, dependent origination is deep, it's nuanced, it's has the ability to point us towards the very deep conditioning that binds us to suffering. And if we're able to see this, we can unbind from it. We can, hopefully, find freedom from conditioned suffering, freedom from conditioned sorrow, lamentation, death, sickness, old age, all of those things. We can wake up to our unconditioned nature. Now, what I'll do is pause it for a minute and then come back with some maybe a little bit more about practices we can do regarding exploring this conditioning, exploring this path of conditioning. So far we've looked at dependent origination and the chains on that chain us to the path of becoming a suffering self. And I spoke a little bit about craving and attachment and how we can work with that. So I think probably one other key area to explore also, which is often spoken about, is the link in the chain between feeling and craving. So the reason this is spoken about quite a lot is because it's a rich area in experience that we just need a little bit of mindfulness with in order to recognize, there is feeling that's arisen because of, an event or a phenomena, and then from that comes craving, like a almost instant desire to get more of or less of something, and it kind of happens instantly, or at least it does at the beginning when we start exploring it. And we can recognize that actually I don't necessarily have to move into an action of craving just because I feel something. So those feelings are normally divided between three kind of feeling tones, either pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, or neutral feelings. So you can see how if I have a pleasant feeling, the movement of craving next, the conditioned movement of craving is I want more pleasantness. Or if I have an unpleasant feeling, the movement of craving is I want to get rid of, I'm craving it not to be here. And you can also get, I'm craving something other than this. I'm craving some kind of sedation, let's say, some kind of distraction. And often with the neutral feelings, that's kind of like the rich area of boredom, isn't it? Like I'm kind of craving anything other than this neutrality because it's too difficult to be with, as an example. But the reason this is a rich area to explore is because if we become familiar with our feelings, get close to our feelings, the way that feelings arise from contact with the world, and you can see the next condition kind of earlier in the chain is contact. We contact the world through the six senses, and then feelings arise, either good, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, and those feelings, they drive craving. And if we don't see that, we don't experience that, we are bound to suffer. We're still attached to this chain of becoming. So maybe the next time something happens, could be really simple, and a feeling arises. Let's say it's a feeling of anger that arises because of something your partner said. So there's been contact, we've experienced our partner, words have been said, and then a feeling of anger arises. Notice how the almost instantaneous movement is through craving to try and get something, to try and change the situation, and see if we're able to just be with the feeling. Instead of just propelling ourselves onto this path of, I'm going to become this, I'm going to get this, I'm going to get rid of that. Instead of that, just recognizing, this is the feeling of anger. How does this feel? This is the way it is right now. Can I be with it? And just sit with it and explore. And it might sound like pretty dull work, but actually this is historically seen as a gap because it's really rich. It's a rich place to explore and to get a bit of purchase on, this path or this chain of becoming, this chain of suffering. And the more we become familiar with our feelings, the more we unbind from these conditions, from this conditionality, from this dependent arising web of conditions that make us suffer, that keep us suffering. And the way it normally plays out is if you work with this long enough, let's say you be with these feelings of frustration again and again and again, without moving into craving, soon, well, maybe not soon, hopefully soon, but at some point, the feelings just subside. We unbind. We unbind from the conditioning. And we start to notice, oh, that thing that in the past made me go, go crazy and act out in the world, now the same event can happen and there's no craving. I don't need to move away. There's not actually any feeling at all. It doesn't drive action. And there's freedom there. In that gap between feeling and craving, there is access to freedom. The ability to open to the way of being that's not conditioned, that isn't bound to result in suffering due to our conditioning. So yeah, I would definitely recommend not just learning these things. I mean, learning them is one thing, but really it's pointing to practice, how we can see the way which we become day by day, moment by moment, and how most of the time that's heedless through conditioning. So with gentle attention and exploration, we can start to recognize this path of becoming and unbind from it. And if we're able to fully unbind from this chain of becoming, we are essentially no longer destined to suffer. We open up to freedom. So dependent arising is, or dependent co-production, whatever you want to call it, it's a deep, profound insight into the nature of mind, into the nature of human existence, because it shows us how we are blindly conditioned, and from that conditioning, we're destined to suffer. And if we can see that conditioning playing out, we then get the chance to work with, well, what else is here? You know, if I'm not reacting to life through conditioning, what else is there? Is there the ability to respond to life creatively instead of reacting to life habitually? Allowing something to arise from clear seeing as opposed to this chain of becoming which always arises from ignorance. And if you depending on where you are on the path or how you want to play, I mean, you can explore with all of these different links in the chain. So another good one to explore is how our senses arise dependent upon name and form. So the senses of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and the sixth sense is cognition, our cognizant mind. What the Buddha's saying is that arises dependent upon the name and forms which we attach to phenomena, really. So we can say, okay, well, how or do I even notice the naming of forms and the forming of conditions? Do I see that playing out in the world? Do I see myself getting hooked onto the names and shapes of apparent things? And we can explore that. We can maybe ask, would it be possible to see a situation, see an environment, see a person without an assumed name or identity attached to them? So this goes really, really deep. And like I said, it kind of points way beyond the self-referential structure, because that ignorance that drives this entire web of becoming, it's kind of beyond self. There's no self attached to that ignorance. And you might be thinking, well, what's it ignorance of? Can I not just fast forward this and go straight to the ignorance? Get rid of the ignorance or see through the ignorance and therefore no longer suffer or become. I mean, yeah, I guess, give it a go. Why not? But it's very tricky. Like I said earlier, it's a bit like falling out of a tree and trying to count the branches on the way down. It's very challenging to see how ignorance and volition and name and form plays out in our moment-by-moment experience. So this is why areas like feeling and craving are really rich for exploration. I mean, one last thing that I'll point to is when we talk about the ignorance that conditions this web of becoming, this chain of becoming, well, what's it ignorant of? Like, what are we ignorant of? What are we not seeing? Well, we're not seeing the nature of conditions. We're not seeing the nature of existence, the nature of truth, the Dharma. So Dharma means truth. Now, I'm not talking about a fixed truth, but the nature of conditions is that they come and go without fail. All conditions are impermanence. They are, by their very nature, not self. They are not substantial. And they are not permanently satisfying. They are dukkha. They are unsatisfactory as something to attach to. And until we see through that movement of mind, which isn't dependent upon self, really, it's kind of baked into how we've grown in the world. But until we see through that movement of mind that says there are things that are permanent, that hang around, and they're going to deeply satisfy me, until we see through that, we're going to be destined to suffer and to become on this path of becoming, to become the one who suffers. So I hope that's quite helpful. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. I definitely recommend reading some suttas if you're interested in this stuff. There's one, I mentioned one before, the Paticca-samuppada-vibhanga Sutta, and the Maha Nidana Sutta is one of my favourites. It's a deep dive into the nature of causality, this, and how it binds us to suffering. It's very direct, but also, and simple, but difficult to explore, difficult to be within our own experience. So yeah, if you want to read those and explore to your heart's content, that'd be fantastic. But really, this is more of just a call for us to, practice a bit with regards to the nature of conditions and conditioned existence, and really deeply see how we are bound to those conditions and how we're bound to suffer. And if we're able to see that, we can then explore what it is to not be bound to conditions, to reside as the unconditioned.